I didn't decide to go back in. That's the first thing to understand. There was no decision. The gate was behind me, the child wasn't, and so I went back. It's the same as breathing. You don't decide to breathe. You just notice you've stopped and then you fix it. The alien commander told me later that he'd spent the first hour of transit convinced I was dead. He said he'd even begun composing the notification form, the standard casualty report template his species uses, which takes 12 minutes to fill out properly and requires the next of kin's primary bioluminescent identifier. He said he'd gotten through the first 4 fields. I told him I was sorry for the trouble. He looked at me in a way I've come to recognize, which is the look of someone realizing that I'm not joking, and then he went quiet for a long time. That was 3 months later over tea on a station where nobody was shooting at anything. By then the child was somewhere safe, learning words in a language she hadn't spoken before we took her out. I got one message from the relocation facility. It said she'd eaten 3 full portions at dinner and had started sleeping without the lights on. That was all. It was enough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the colony. Victories was a transit hub. That's the technical classification in the Interspecies Compacts Infrastructure Registry, a Grade 3 transit hub servicing the outer Solvith agricultural ring, supporting a permanent civilian population of just under 12,000, mostly Alani. If you look at the registry entry, it's 3 lines. Transit hub, Grade 3, outer Solvith agricultural ring. That's what it says. What it doesn't say is that Victories sits on a moon that the Compact's original survey teams classified as a Class 17 predation world, before anyone had figured out how to build properly sealed habitats on worlds above Class 12. The colony went up in a hurry, 40 years before I got there. A boom in the agricultural yields on the ring worlds had created a bottleneck in the shipping lanes, and somebody decided that building a transit hub on the nearest convenient moon was cheaper than routing around it. The sealing technology had improved enough by then that the habitat modules were considered safe. The survey team's classification had been quietly downgraded in the registry to a Class 14 notation for insurance purposes. Class 14, like that matters. Like the things in the dark, outside the colony walls cared what the registry said. I want to be clear that I'm not angry about any of this. I'm not telling you what happened to be angry. I'm telling you what happened because people ask, and because I think it helps to understand the situation correctly before you try to understand what I did or what I didn't do, which in my view is the more important part. We were on Victories for 6 days before it went wrong. The extraction contract had come through the standard Joint Operations Clearinghouse, Compact Joint Military, a mixed species unit rotation meant to standardize interoperability across the member species defense forces. The idea was that if you mix the force compositions enough, you'd eventually get units that could function together under pressure instead of just during peacetime exercises. My unit was a 12-person detachment. 8 Alani soldiers, 2 Solvith engineers attached for infrastructure assessment, 1 Solvith field medic named Victories, and me. I was the only human. I want to say that was fine, and it mostly was. The Alani soldiers were professional, quiet, and took orders without ego, which is more than I can say for some human units I've rotated through. The Solvith engineers were meticulous. Victories was good at her job. The unit commander was an Alani officer named Sarath Kaul, about 40 years into a career that had taken him through 3 active conflicts and 2 peacekeeping rotations, and he had the quiet steadiness of someone who had stopped being surprised by what war looked like a long time ago. The assignment was a standard infrastructure assessment and partial civilian relocation. The transit hub had been flagged 6 months earlier when the habitat seals on the outer ring began failing, stress fractures in the original fabrication, plus 40 years of temperature cycling that nobody had budgeted for in the maintenance schedule. The Compact had ordered a staged drawdown of the civilian population. 12,000 people, moved out over 8 months on a prioritized schedule based on location, health, and operational dependency. By the time we arrived, the population was down to about 3,400, all in the inner ring, which still had functioning seals. Our job was to assist the final civilian staging, logistics, security, morale, whatever was needed, and to assess whether the inner ring seals would hold through the last 2 months of the drawdown schedule. The assessment part was the engineer's job. The security part was ours. For 6 days it was routine. The Alani civilians were calm and organized. They'd had months to prepare. The children were the hardest part, not because they were panicked, but because they understood enough to be afraid and not quite enough to know that their fear was justified, which makes them quiet in a way that's harder to look at than crying. I learned about 6 words of Alani in those 6 days, mostly food words. Children are easier to talk to if you can name things they eat. The girl's name was Vane. She was maybe 7 years old, though Alani aging isn't linear the way human aging is, so the developmental equivalent was probably closer to 5. Small even by Alani standards, which meant she came to about mid-thigh on me. She had the wide-spectrum bioluminescent markings that young Alani carry, a pattern of pale blue-green that runs along the jaw and the forearm ridge and brightens when they're stressed or excited. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I just thought she was beautiful in the way that alien children sometimes are, which is a complicated thing to carry because beauty like that makes you more careful about the distance between them and whatever is outside the walls. She didn't have parents. Nobody in our detachment knew exactly why. The civilian coordinator who would have had that information had been evacuated in the previous wave. The colony's social registry showed her listed under the care of an elderly Alani woman named Deathworld, who had been evacuated 3 days before we arrived with a respiratory condition that wouldn't wait for the staged schedule. The registry showed Vane listed as pending transfer to primary custodian relocation intake with a case number attached. The case number would have resolved itself in the next wave. She was on the list. It just hadn't been our list. On the 6th day, the outer ring collapsed. Not all at once. It doesn't work like that. One of the Solvith engineers, Rethanvar, had flagged a stress concentration in the eastern outer ring's primary seal brace 3 days earlier and submitted a maintenance order. The maintenance order was sitting in an automated queue. The queue was 37 requests deep, and the maintenance team was down to 6 people from a normal complement of 30. Because most of the maintenance staff had been evacuated in earlier waves because they had families and children, and the system had correctly prioritized them. The Eastern Seal failed at 3:40 local time. Rethanvar's alert woke me up from a dead sleep because she'd set the monitoring system to flag her directly, and when she checked it and saw what was happening, she had the presence of mind to trigger the unit alert channel before she did anything else. I was dressed and at the command post in 4 minutes. By then, Sarathkal had the picture. The eastern seal was gone. The outer ring was open to the moon's surface. The inner ring seals were holding, but the pressure differential from the eastern breach was doing structural things to the transition corridor between the outer and inner ring. The connector passage, about 40 meters long, that the remaining 3,000-plus civilians would need to transit to reach the evacuation staging area. Rethanvar gave the connector corridor a structural viability window of 90 minutes before the pressure differential would compromise the seals at either end. 90 minutes, about 3,000 civilians. The math worked if we started immediately and kept them moving. We started immediately. I won't describe the whole evacuation in detail. It was loud and dark, and the ground shook twice from whatever the outer ring's collapse was doing to the subsurface infrastructure, and a lot of the civilians were in the middle of sleeping and had to be moved out with their children in their arms and their light patterns cycling through distress frequencies I'd never seen before. Sarathkal organized the transit groups in the first 12 minutes. He was very good at this, calm, specific, no wasted words. He ran his people on a simple relay, 2 soldiers at the front of each transit group, 2 at the rear, civilian flow between them. The corridor was wide enough for 4 to move abreast if people stayed composed, and the Alani civilians, to their credit, largely stayed composed. They'd had months to prepare for this. The children were the ones who didn't stay composed, but children's panic is predictable in the ways that adult panic isn't, and Sarathkal's people had been working with the children's blocks for 6 days and knew most of them by sight. I was working the rear, not because anyone assigned me there, but because the rear was where the most variables collected, and I'm better at variables than relay coordination. The relay is about maintaining a rate. The rear is about catching everything the rate leaves behind. An elderly Alani woman who couldn't move at relay speed. A family who'd gone back to their module for something and needed to be turned around. A young male Alani civilian who kept stopping to look back at the outer ring, the way people do when they can't quite believe they're not coming back. I turned him around 3 times in 45 minutes. The 3rd time I put my hand between his shoulder blades and kept it there until we were through the corridor. He didn't resist. Sometimes people just need the decision made for them. Sarathkal was very good. His people were very good. We got the first 2,000 through the connector corridor in 53 minutes. That's when the things came in through the eastern breach. The survey teams had documented them as Apex class, the original classification that had earned Veth Karath its Class 17 designation before the downgrade. The registry entry describes them as insectoid, pack-coordinated, chitinous primary structure, no known natural predators on the moon's surface. The description is accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't fully convey is the sound they make, a low harmonic resonance that the chitinous plates produce when they move quickly, which is a frequency that sits at the bottom edge of what humans can hear and seems to do something unpleasant to the Alani nervous system. Sarathkal told me later on the station that the frequency triggers a stress cascade in Alani physiology that degrades fine motor coordination and induces a flight behavioral override in about 60% of the population. Not a panic, more specific than that. The body starts moving before the mind catches up. I felt it as a vibration in my back teeth, low and wrong. What it meant in practical terms was that the remaining 1,000 civilians in the connector corridor and the inner ring staging area began moving faster and less coherently than they had been, and Sarathkal's unit, which was Alani, began degrading in the way that the behavioral cascade degrades you, not breaking, not fleeing, but losing the crisp precision that the first 2 hours of the evacuation had depended on. They held. I want to be clear about that. They held. But they were working harder to hold than a human unit would have been, and the holding cost something. I was at the rear of the connector corridor when the first pack came through the outer ring breach. I say pack. The survey documentation uses the word coordinated hunting group. Both are accurate. There were 11 of them in the first group, moving in a loose chevron that compressed as they entered the narrower corridor space, and the 2 in front were already inside before the Alani rearguard registered what was happening. Not because the rearguard was slow, because the frequency had taken something off the top of their processing speed, and the things moved very fast. I won't say it was clean. Clean is a word for training scenarios. The corridor was 40 meters wide at the outer end and narrowed to 20 at the inner junction, and the things moved in a way that used the vertical surfaces, the walls, the ceiling struts, whatever they could anchor the leading legs to, which meant the chevron they'd entered and opened into something more three-dimensional than a standard ground-bound threat. The 2 in front went for the nearest movement, which was the rear guard soldiers on my left and right, and both Alani soldiers went aground not from injury, but from the behavioral cascade pulling their legs under them. The cascade isn't a failure of will. Sarathkal explained that to me afterward with some precision in case I'd thought otherwise. It's a neurological override. You can fight it, and his soldiers did fight it, but fighting it takes processing that you can't give to other things simultaneously. The 4 minutes. I want to describe this accurately. I counted during it, the way you count when you're managing the interval between contacts and need to know how much you've spent and how much remains. The first 2 went down before I was fully at the range I'd have preferred. The next 3 in the corridor's narrowest section, which they were using as a compression point. The chitinous plates scraping the walls as the body plans folded to fit, which is a sound I'll be able to describe until I'm very old. 7 and 8 on the exterior arc as the pack's chevron tried to reform behind the contact point, using 2 remaining charge cartridges at a range that was not comfortable. The last 3 broke back through the outer corridor toward the breach before I could close the distance, which was the correct thing to do from their perspective. I've since read more of the survey documentation, and the pack behavior at that range is consistent with tactical disengagement, not rout. They went because the engagement had stopped being favorable, not because they were incapable of continuing. 4 minutes, 7 of 11 down, the remaining 4 at the breach, which gave Sarathkal the window he needed. Anithvar's hand was on the collapse charge trigger before I'd reached the inner end of the corridor. I said go. She triggered it. The corridor came down in a controlled sequence, 3 charges at measured intervals, a sound like the habitat itself making a decision, then silence, then the sound of settling material. Both ends sealed. The breach path closed. We sealed the inner end of the connector corridor, both ends, the breach path blocked. We had 2,114 civilians in the inner staging area. The evacuation landers had been on approach for 22 minutes. We had a count. Sarathkal had a count. He had a count because he was thorough, and he'd set his people to counting from the moment the alarm went up, and thorough Alani officers count everyone. That count told him we had 2,114. The original inner ring roster we'd been working from was 2,116. He called the discrepancy over the unit channel while the first lander was touching down. 2 missing, both from the family block in the inner ring's northern residential module, an elderly couple who had already been listed as sheltering in place pending medical clearance. Sarathkal's roster showed they'd been cleared and moved 40 minutes into the evacuation, so they should be in the count. But they weren't. And then the second discrepancy. 1 child, Vane, listed as moving with the northern residential block, not in the count. Sarathkal sent 2 of his soldiers back into the inner ring to find the elderly couple. They found them in 4 minutes. The couple had moved into a secondary shelter bay when the ground shook the first time, and they were safe and uninjured and embarrassed about the confusion. They were in the count before the first lander had finished loading. Vane was not in any shelter bay. Vane was not in any count. Vane had been near the back of the Northern Residential Blocks Transit Group, and the Northern Residential Blocks Transit Group had been the group nearest to the connector corridor when the pack came through, and in the 4 minutes of engagement and the immediate aftermath movement. The transit group had fragmented and reassembled, and in the reassembly, a small child who was already frightened and whose light patterns had been cycling distress frequencies for 2 hours, had apparently moved into a corridor branch that was not the one leading to the staging area. The Alani have a word for this. I don't speak enough of the language to tell you what the word is. What Sarathkal told me it meant later was something like, the one who takes the wrong turning in the dark, implies no fault. Just the particular tragedy of a moment of wrong orientation, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Vane had taken the wrong turning in the dark. She was somewhere in the inner ring. The inner ring seals were holding. For now, the connector corridor was collapsed and sealed. The eastern breach was still open, and the pack outside it was 11-7, and the 4 remaining had been joined, since the corridor engagement, by another group whose harmonic frequency Rethanvar's sensors were picking up at a range of about 40 meters from the eastern breach. Rethanvar put the new group at 8 to 12 individuals. The evacuation landers were on a 90-minute rotation schedule. One set down, loaded, and left, The next would arrive in 90 minutes. The inner ring seals, Rethanvar told me, had a remaining structural integrity window that she estimated at 4 to 6 hours. The pack would not stop probing. The eastern breach was open. The inner ring had approximately 4 to 6 hours before something found a way in. Sarath Kal made the call. He made it quickly and he made it cleanly. The way a 40-year officer makes a hard call when the math is clear, and the weight of his responsibility is to the 2,116 he has accounted for, and the lander is on the ground, and the rotation window is 90 minutes, and one child is missing in a 4 to 6 hour viability window with an active pack outside. He said, "We load the civilians. We document the situation. The next rotation sends a search team in with full-spectrum predator countermeasures and thermal tracking equipment, which we do not currently have. We leave a beacon inside the staging area entrance broadcasting on Alani primary distress frequencies. We go." He was right. I knew he was right. His math was right and his logic was right and his responsibility was right, and I've thought about it every day since, and he was right. I said, "I'm going back in." He looked at me for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 seconds. He said, "I can't authorize that." He said it with the particular inflection that means he's not trying to stop me, only placing the record correctly, making sure we both knew that if I went on my own judgment, not his order. I said, "I know." He gave me everything he could give me in 60 seconds. Thermal scope from Rethanvar's kit, 2 additional charge cartridges for my primary, a signal beacon set to my personal frequency so the next rotation's thermal tracking would find me if I was down, a water supply from Vetharsane's medical pack, Anathvar's colony layout display, pulled to the section marked Inner Ring, Northern Residential, current seal integrity overlaid in amber. I went back in through the staging area emergency access point, which was a narrow maintenance tunnel at the base of the northern-facing habitat wall, sealed with a manual pressure lock. I went in alone. The inner ring was quieter than I expected. That's the thing about a habitat that's 90% evacuated. It's not dark exactly, because the emergency lighting stays on, but it's a particular kind of quiet that isn't natural. The acoustic environment of a habitat built for 12,000 people is full of unconscious noise that you never notice until it's gone. Ventilation hum, the vibration of feet on decking, the composite layering of 12,000 metabolisms running their background processes. All of that was gone. What I had instead was emergency lighting at 40%, and the hum of the seal maintenance systems still running their cycles, and the distant harmonic of the pack outside doing whatever it does when it moves. I didn't run. Running in an unknown thermal environment with a pack nearby that might have penetrated further than Rethanvar's sensors showed was how you ran into something before you had the visual field to engage it cleanly. I moved fast and I moved with intention, but I moved the way you move when the cost of a mistake is high, which is controlled and deliberate. The northern residential block was about 300 meters from the staging area entrance through 2 habitat corridors and a connecting atrium. The Alani architect who designed the inner ring had built the atrium as a community space. I'd been through it twice during the 6 days of the assessment, and both times there had been small groups of children at the central play structures and adults at the seating clusters along the perimeter, and the light had been coming through the dome panels in the amber green that Alani favor. Now the dome panels were showing emergency lighting, and the seating clusters were empty, and the central play structures cast angular shadows that moved with the ventilation current. I turned the thermal scope on and swept the atrium before I crossed it. The scope showed me heat signatures from the ventilation system, nothing else. Nothing large enough to be a pack animal, nothing small enough to be a child in a corner. I crossed the atrium. The northern residential block's main corridor was a long straight run with residential module doors on either side, all sealed in their emergency position. The habitat had automatically locked the modules when the evacuation alarm went up. The transit group would have moved through here heading south toward the staging area. Vane would have been somewhere in that transit group, and somewhere in this corridor she'd gotten separated and moved somewhere that wasn't south. I stood at the northern end of the main corridor and thought about where a frightened 7-year-old goes when she loses the group. Not forward. Forward is where the noise is, and frightened children don't move toward noise. Not any of the sealed module doors. Those required a bioluminescent authentication signature that a 7-year-old wouldn't be able to provide. But there was a branch corridor at the 2/3 point of the main corridor run, marked on Onethvar's display as a maintenance access corridor running west toward the inner ring's water recycling units. Maintenance corridors in Alani habitat design are narrow by adult standards, wide enough for maintenance equipment, not comfortable for a full-grown adult, wide enough for a child. And maintenance corridor doors are on mechanical latches, not biometric authentication, because maintenance needs to be possible without working authentication in an emergency. I went to the branch corridor. The door was open, not ajar, open, pulled all the way against the wall, in the particular way that means someone small pulled it and went through it and didn't think about closing it. I went in. The maintenance corridor was lit by the lowest tier of the habitat's emergency lighting, a dim amber that the thermal scope didn't need, but that helped me read the space without turning my full attention to the scope. The corridor ran about 40 meters before it branched again, left toward the water recycling units, right toward some secondary service point that Onethvar's display labeled Atmospheric Exchange Secondary 3. I stopped and listened. The maintenance infrastructure of a habitat this size runs its own ambient sounds, pumps cycling, pressure equalizers doing their routine adjustments, the low vibration of the atmospheric processors running their standard cycle. I'd been in the habitat for 6 days, and I'd been in maintenance spaces twice during the assessment work, so I knew the baseline well enough to subtract it. Nothing from the left, from the right something, very quiet, barely there. A maintenance pump cycles at a consistent interval. Pressure equalizers have a signature rhythm. The atmospheric processors run a continuous low hum that doesn't vary. I'd learned all of those in 6 days, unconsciously, the way you learn the background of a place you're working in. What I was hearing from the right didn't match any of those patterns. It was too irregular to be mechanical, small variations in interval that machinery doesn't produce. It was too quiet to be threat relevant. The pack made a harmonic you felt before you heard it, and this was the opposite, something I was hearing before I felt anything at all. I've spent enough time in situations where the thing I'm trying not to hear is the thing that kills me that I've gotten careful about identifying sound before I respond to it. I stood still for about 15 seconds, and what I was hearing from the right was a sound pattern, with the particular cadence of something that is trying very hard not to make any noise at all and occasionally failing. I went right. The secondary atmospheric exchange unit was in a small service chamber at the end of the right branch, a room about 3 meters by 4 meters, crowded with maintenance equipment, the atmospheric exchange housing taking up most of the far wall. The emergency lighting in here was the dim amber of the corridor. There was a narrow space between the exchange housing and the side wall, and the thermal scope painted it clearly. A small heat signature, tucked all the way into the back corner, compact, arms wrapped around itself. Vane was sitting with her back to the corner, her forearms pulled in close, her face tucked down. The bioluminescent markings on her jaw and forearms were cycling through a rapid, low-amplitude pattern I hadn't seen before. Not the bright stress flare I'd seen when the ground shook, but something slower and dimmer, like a light going out in pulses. I turned off the thermal scope and crouched down in the entrance to the narrow space, so I was at her level. "Vane," I said. She went very still. The bioluminescent cycling paused. I knew about 6 words of Alani, food words and the word for safe, which the Solvith medic Vetharsane had taught me on day 2 because she said it was the most important word to know in any alien language, and she was right. I said the word for safe. I said it the way Vetharsane had said it to me, not loudly, not as a command, just as a fact being offered. Vane looked up. She looked at me for a moment. Then she made a sound, a 2-tone Alani vocalization I didn't have a word for, and reached out both arms toward me with the full body extension that I've since been told is what Alani children do when they're asking to be carried, and they've run out of other options. I moved into the narrow space and picked her up. She weighed about what a human child of equivalent developmental stage would weigh, which is to say not much. She tucked herself against my shoulder with the immediate completeness that small children have when they're done being alone, and the bioluminescent markings on her jaw ran a steady, slow pulse against my neck that I later learned was the Alani infant comfort response, which their caregivers typically induce by holding them and pressing a thumb to the forearm marking until it sinks. She had been in the service chamber for something between 90 minutes and 2 hours by my estimate, alone in the amber dim, listening to what she could hear from the main corridors and the outer ring and the colony's dying infrastructure, and she had stayed quiet the entire time, not because she wasn't afraid, because she'd found the quietest corner of the quietest room she could reach and made herself as small and still as she could, which is what frightened things do when they have nowhere else to go. I held her and stood up slowly, and took a moment to make sure she was secure before I moved. Then I thought about the route back. I had the child. The child was unhurt, frightened, and would be as frightened as she was going to be for the duration. She was in my arms and not somewhere I couldn't reach her. The route back was 300 meters, 2 corridors, an atrium, and a maintenance tunnel to the staging area emergency access point. The challenge with carrying a child on a route with an active threat is that your operational geometry changes. You have one arm effectively fixed. The thermal scope and the primary both require 2-hand engagement at close range if the contact is fast. The things in the corridor had been fast, and 1-hand engagement is possible, but is a degraded solution, particularly in dim lighting with a moving hold on something you cannot drop. I've trained for it. Training for it and doing it at 90 meters from an uncertainty band are 2 different things. I thought about the route. I thought about the collapsed connector corridor and the 40 meters of debris between the inner ring's eastern wall and the outer breach. I thought about the fact that the thermal scope hadn't shown me anything in the atrium 10 minutes ago, and the pack's approach had not been silent. The harmonic resonance was a consistent advance indicator, and I could place it at the back of my teeth, which meant I had a rough directional fix even without the scope. The harmonic was at the back of my teeth, low, consistent, not louder than it had been, not closer. I went. The secondary atmospheric exchange service chamber, the right branch of the maintenance corridor, the main maintenance corridor. The 40 meters at a controlled pace, now different because I had the child, and my pace was calibrated differently. Faster in the clear sections, slower at the branch junctions. The scope in my right hand and Vane's weight distributed on my left arm the way you carry something you're not going to put down. Vane made no sound. Her face was tucked against my shoulder and her arms were around my neck, and she was very still, in the way a child is still when it has decided that stillness is what the adult holding it needs. I don't know if she understood the operational situation. Children sometimes understand more than adults think they do, and sometimes they simply mirror the affect of the person holding them. Either way, she was still. The maintenance corridor door. The main residential corridor. 40 meters of sealed modules and amber emergency lighting, the corridor running straight south toward the atrium. The harmonic was constant, not gaining. The first junction corridor, the second. The atrium. I stopped at the atrium entrance and swept the thermal scope, before stepping into the open space. 40 meters of dome-ceilinged open floor, the emergency lighting running amber shadows off the central play structures. During the assessment, I'd seen children at those structures every afternoon, their bioluminescent markings running the bright, rapid patterns of play, and the adults on the perimeter seating watching them with the particular quality of attention that means known and safe and mine. All of that was gone. Amber shadows, angular shapes. The perimeter seating empty. Thermal scope, ventilation system signatures in the ceiling struts, nothing else. I held the scope for 10 seconds. The harmonic was constant, unchanged, same directional reading it had been since I'd entered the inner ring, same depth in the back teeth. I went into the atrium. 40 meters, vein still on my left arm, scope still in my right hand, the open space changing the acoustic profile the way open spaces always do. I noted it and moved through it. The far wall, the junction corridors, then the staging area's north entrance, its emergency lighting the cool blue of the loading systems, a different color than the amber emergency lighting of the inner ring, and I felt the shift of it as a kind of relief I didn't acknowledge until I was through. The maintenance tunnel access point at the base of the northern wall, manual pressure lock, still sealed the way I'd left it. I shifted vein to my right arm, worked the pressure lock with my left, and got the tunnel open. She went through first. I set her down at the tunnel entrance and she crawled through on her own, which she seemed to find less terrifying than I'd expected, maybe because tunnels are comprehensible when atmospheres are not. I went through behind her and pulled the tunnel hatch sealed. The staging area was on the other side. Sarathkal was there. He and 2 of his soldiers were standing at the staging area's main loading point, and when I came through the tunnel with the child in my arms, one of the soldiers said something in Alani that I didn't understand, and Sarathkal went very still for a moment in the way that he went still when he was processing something that required adjustment. Then he crossed the staging area floor and held out his arms, and I handed Vane to him, and he held her with the practiced ease of someone who knows how to hold an Alani child, both forearms supporting, the child's bioluminescent markings accessible to his thumb, which he touched to her forearm, marking in the way I now know is how Alani caregivers sync the comfort response. The marking ran steady. Vane made the two-tone sound again, quieter. Sarathkal looked at me over the child's head. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, in the very precise interspecies standard that career officers speak when they want to be exact, "How?" I understood that he wasn't asking how I'd found her or how I'd gotten back. He was asking a different how. He was asking how I'd done it in terms of what was inside me that made the calculation come out the way it did. I thought about that. I thought about it for longer than I usually think about things, standing in the staging area under the cool blue loading lights with the harmonic frequency faint at the back of my teeth, and the child's bioluminescent markings pulsing slow and steady against Sarathkal's forearm. "I don't know," I said. "I just needed to find her." He accepted that. He didn't push it. He'd been in the military long enough to know that some answers are complete when they're simple. We were at the staging area for another 23 minutes before the next rotation lander touched down. Vethar Sane checked Vane over, no injuries, mild stress indicators well within normal range, hydration adequate. The food words I knew turned out to be useful. Vane ate 2 portions of whatever Vethar Sane had in the medical pack that was Alani safe, and her bioluminescent markings ran steadier with each one. On the lander, she sat next to me for the transit. She slept against my arm before we reached orbit, the way children sleep when they've run out of fear, and the motion of the vehicle has done what motion does. The bioluminescent markings on her jaw ran very slow and very dim, the rhythm of sleep, I think, though I can't be certain. I didn't move for the whole transit. We transferred to the orbital processing station, where the other evacuees from the previous waves were staged for relocation assignment. The relocation facility's intake coordinator found the case file with Vane's custody designation and the pending transfer notation, and within 6 hours there was a resolution on it. A family in the Alani resettlement community on Kethsalane Prime, relatives of Vethwarn who'd been registered as emergency alternate custodians, and who'd spent the 6 hours of the previous waves trying to get into the system to flag themselves as available. The intake coordinator showed me the resolution form. Case closed, she said. Pending transfer resolved. She said it with a kind of bureaucratic satisfaction that I recognized as genuine. She'd been working the resolution for hours, and she'd gotten it right. I said that was good. She asked if I wanted to log a report on the retrieval. I said Sarathkal's unit report would cover it. She made a note and moved on to the next form. I went and found a place to sit down. Sarathkal found me there about an hour later. He brought 2 cups of something warm that was the Alani equivalent of tea. I'd had it once before, and it tastes like ash and pine to a human palate. But it was warm and I was cold in the way you get cold when the adrenaline is done. He sat down and handed me the cup, and we sat there for a while without talking. Then he said, "The survey documentation on the pack." I said, "What about it?" He said, "Vibrational resonance-based sensory mapping, effective range uncertain, 30 to 50 meters in standard atmospheric density." He paused. "You knew that?" I said I'd read it. He said, "That's a wide uncertainty band." I said I'd noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The maintenance corridor is not 300 meters from the eastern breach." I said, "I know." "Closer to 90, he said. I said, "I know." He looked at me for a long moment. He had the particular look that Alani senior officers get when they're revising a calculation they thought was complete. A very still face with the bioluminescent markings, running a slow, controlled cycle that means thinking rather than stress. I'd learned to read that look over 6 days. He said, "What were you going to do if one of them was already inside?" I thought about that too. I thought about the thermal scope and the charge cartridges I'd taken from Rethanvar. I thought about the narrow maintenance corridor and the service chamber, and the space between the exchange housing and the wall. I thought about 40 meters of collapsed corridor and an uncertainty band of 30 to 50 meters, and the difference between 90 meters and 30. I said whatever I needed to. He accepted that too. He had the grace not to push it. I didn't tell him what I actually thought, which is that the answer is simpler than the math. The math was a calculation about risk and probability and uncertainty bands and viable outcomes in a constrained operational window. The math is real, and the math matters, and I am not saying the math doesn't matter. But the math is not why I went back in. I went back in because Vane was in there. That's the whole answer. I went back in because she was in there and I wasn't, and that was a condition I could change, and so I changed it. The pack and the uncertainty band and the 90 meters and the atmospheric density were all real, and they all mattered, and they were all part of the operational problem I had to solve once I was inside. But they were not what made me go. What made me go is harder to explain than that, and I've thought about it enough times now that I have a sense of what it is, though I don't have a clean word for it. It's something like, there are conditions that are permissible and conditions that are not, and child alone in the dark while pack animals find their way in is a condition that is not permissible, not in my presence, not while I am a person who can do something about it. That's not a decision. That's just how the world is organized from where I'm standing. Sarathkal filed the casualty report on the 7 pack animals in the connector corridor as hostile fauna, neutralized, joint operation standard engagement, no further notation required. The after-action report on the evacuation noted that all 3,417 civilian residents of the Inner Ring had been successfully transferred to the orbital processing station, with full resolution of custody and relocation designations within 12 hours of arrival. It noted one emergency re-entry into the inner ring by Joint Operations personnel for civilian recovery. It described the outcome as a complete success. I don't disagree with any of that. It was a complete success. 3,417 people on a station, alive, with a place to go. Rethanvar's next inspection confirmed the inner ring seals failed 6 hours after we cleared it. The pack found the breach in the collapsed connector corridor within 4 hours of our departure and was inside the inner ring by hour 5. Nothing was in there to find. Sarathkal filed the casualty report on the 7 pack animals in the connector corridor as hostile fauna, neutralized, Joint Operations Standard engagement, no further notation required. The after-action report on the evacuation noted that all 3,417 civilian residents of the inner ring had been successfully transferred to the orbital processing station, with full resolution of custody and relocation designations within 12 hours of arrival. It noted one emergency re-entry into the inner ring by Joint Operations personnel for civilian recovery. It described the outcome as a complete success. I don't disagree with any of that. It was a complete success. 3,417 people on a station, alive, with a place to go. Rethanvar's next inspection confirmed the inner ring seals failed 6 hours after we cleared it. The pack found the breach in the collapsed connector corridor within 4 hours of our departure and was inside the inner ring by hour 5. Nothing was in there to find. I've thought about that part, the hour 5 part. I think about it specifically in the way you think about the overlap between things that happened and things that could have happened, which is a mental exercise with no productive outcome, but one I can't always avoid. By hour 5, Vane would have been in the service chamber for approximately 7 hours. The pack's effective sensory range was estimated at 30 to 50 meters in standard atmospheric density. The service chamber at the end of the maintenance corridor's right branch was approximately 90 meters from the inner ring's eastern wall. Approximately, in a structure that was losing seal integrity. I don't spend a lot of time on the hour 5 calculation. It doesn't help anything. What it does is clarify why the timing of the count, and the counting itself, and Sarathkal's particular thoroughness in running it, those matter. You can recover from a lot of things if you know about them fast enough. The count took 12 minutes to close the discrepancy on the elderly couple. It would have taken 12 minutes to close the discrepancy on Vane if she'd been findable. The fact that it closed with me already back inside, rather than standing at the staging area entrance, was just the shape of how the time moved. 3 months later, on the station, over Ashen Pine Tea, Sarathkal asked me what Earth was like. I told him it was big and loud, and that most things there were trying to kill most other things, more or less continuously, and that humans had grown up in the middle of it for long enough that some of the parameters had shifted. He said, which parameters? I said, the ones about what's possible to walk away from. He thought about that. He was quiet for a long time, the bioluminescent markings running their slow thinking cycle. Then he said, "You said she was just a child." I said, "She is." He said, "That's all you needed." I said, "Yes." He looked out the station viewport at the orbital approach lane, where a civilian transport was making its slow arc toward the transit hub that had replaced Veth Kareth in the registry, a new facility, built this time on a moon with a Class 9 predation rating and a proper maintenance budget. Out there somewhere, on Keth Saline Prime, a child was eating dinner and learning words and sleeping with the lights off. "I've been in 43 years of joint operations," Sarathkal said. "I've met every species the compact fields. I've read every threat assessment filed on Earth-born personnel." He paused. "None of them say what you just said." I said, "What do they say?" He said, "They say you can't be killed efficiently." I thought about that. I thought about the maintenance corridor and the 90 meters and the 30 to 50 meter uncertainty band. I thought about the connector corridor, 4 minutes, 7 contacts, the particular angle between the thorax plates and the head assembly, and the knowledge of where the joint is. I thought about veins' bioluminescent markings running slow and steady against my neck on the way back through the atrium. I said, "That's not really the point." He said, "No, but it's what the reports say." The tea was getting cold. I drank the rest of it. The station's ventilation ran its low hum through the walls, the kind of background noise that 12,000 metabolisms make when they're all in the same structure together, going about the business of being alive. Sarath Kal picked up his own cup. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, very carefully, in the way he said things when he wanted them to be exact, "What would have happened if you hadn't found her?" It's not really a question, that sentence. It's the kind of thing that people say when they want to understand a decision that doesn't fit the decision-making models they know. I understood what he was asking. He was asking whether I'd had a contingency, whether there was a point at which I would have turned around, whether there was a version of the calculation that produced a different output. I thought about it honestly. I owed him that. "I don't know," I said. "I've never been able to find that version." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the way Alani senior officers nod when they've received an answer that's complete, and they're putting it in the place where complete answers go. "I know," he said. "I looked for it too." He finished his tea. I finished mine. The station ran its hum. The transport made its arc in the view from the viewport, slowing into the transit hub approach, unhurried, full of people going somewhere ordinary. That's the whole of it. 3,417 civilians, one child, one collapsed corridor, one maintenance tunnel, 90 meters of inner ring space, and an uncertainty band in a survey document that I decided to treat as 30 rather than 50. People ask me sometimes if I was afraid. I tell them I was paying attention. They usually think those are two different things. I'm not sure they are. People ask me sometimes if I'd do it again. I tell them the question doesn't quite parse for me, and they think I'm being evasive. I'm not. I mean, the question doesn't parse because, again, implies there was a version where I didn't do it the first time, and I've never been able to find that version either. The child was in there, I wasn't. That's a condition you change. That's the whole equation.